Psychoanalysis and Philosophy, Kant and Bion, Thought and Effect, the Manufacturing Process. Namaste. Kant propounded a deep epistemology, and Bion was the first to bring epistemology into psychoanalysis. Deep dive today is into elusive and esoteric area of how Bion and Kant thought about the manufacturing process involved in genesis of thought and effect. Guide in conversation is Dr. Himanshu Vaidya, the psychoanalysis consultant. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So should we lay out the background first of the work of Kant and Bion, specific to our discussion for today?
Psychotherapy as a whole is centered around three core entities: thought, affect, and action. Based upon which entity you put in the center of your school gets built. If you focus primarily on action, you get into the behavioral school area. You focus primarily on thought, you get into the cognitive area. You focus on affect, you get into the psychodynamic area. You can have combinations like CBT, where you can combine the thought and the action and create a package school out of it. One of the core ideas which remains implicit, unsaid, and accepted almost as an axiom in psychotherapy is the idea that thought and affect are fundamental facts of nature. They are not manufactured entities.
Oh.
That you cannot deconstruct them further into anything. They are fundamental facts of nature, which cannot be reduced to anything other than themselves because they are fundamental. In a sense, they are like the simple objects of philosophy, the simples, the most elemental, which cannot be deconstructed any further. This idea is not actually a correct idea, because Immanuel Kant brings us the manufacturing process of thought, the process of knowing. How do we know? What is the process of knowing? And he lays out the generic process of knowing, which we have discussed before, where the stages are: there is a stimulus, then there is sensation, then there is perception, then there is conception, then there is knowledge, and then there is wisdom. And this is the generic process of knowing according to Immanuel Kant. So he does not believe that thought into itself is an unmanufactured entity. It does undergo a process. Similarly, Bion does not believe that either thought or affect are unmanufactured entities. And therefore, the idea that they are fundamental in a way is challenged by both Immanuel Kant and Bion.
Yeah.
And what Immanuel Kant does is to give us the manufacturing process of a thought. That from the raw material stage of the stimulus to the finished thought in the knowledge stage, you have stages. The stimulus is first recognized by senses and converted into a sensation which the human system can process. Maybe there are different species who have a different form of sensation.
Absolutely.
But we convert the stimulus into a particular entity. When the stimulus gets in touch with our senses convert the stimulus into a sensation that our system can process. And then the sensation becomes a perception, then a conception, then the knowledge. So one of the axiomatic difficulties with psychoanalysis has been that there was an implicit acceptance or a belief that thought and affect, as we call them, we define them in psychoanalysis, are fundamental facts of nature, simples of psychoanalysis, which is not true. So one core element that Bion and Kant both bring into psychoanalysis is the fact that both thought and affect are manufactured entities, and there are more fundamental entities which take part in the process of manufacturing. Now, Kant gives us only a generic way of knowing, a generic process of thinking. He does not go so much into affect. He says all psychic activities by and large follow the same generic process, whether the end result is a thought or the end result is an affect. So he lays down just one generic route of any psychic activity may be resulting in thought or affect. Bion also goes into both thought and affect manufacture, but Bion brings in a very important element, which is the element of the other in early life, in order to enable this manufacturing process of thought and affect. For Immanuel Kant, the model of knowing or feeling any psychic activity was a standalone thinking individual. It was a standalone activity of between the subject and the object. The subject was reflecting and knowing the object. But in Bion, very important element is the presence of the mother, the container, to facilitate the development of capacity to think and to feel. Another important element that Bion brings in is he looks at psychosis in a very different way. Most people in psychoanalysis look at psychosis as affect-driven problem. That the trauma has created such affect, such difficult affect, so difficult to process that the person can either project outside or create a world of his own. Whereas Bion viewed psychosis primarily as a thought problem. Bion also brought into psychoanalysis, and in the context that we are talking about, the concept of thoughts awaiting a thinker.
Thoughts awaiting a thinker.
Thinker, meaning there are proto-elements before a fully developed thought can come into existence. There are proto-elements, constituents of that thought, and they are awaiting something which can catalyze the whole thing and convert it into thought. Think of it in this way: if there are 5 constituents, let us say, which are going to come together and result in a thought. Now the 5 are there agitating, waiting for something to facilitate their coming together so they can result into a thought. But that thing that is awaited is something else. And that point is a point of great distress. It is a point of great discomfort where the proto-elements are ready, agitating, waiting for that final facilitator to come in and enable them to come together through some process and result into a thought. And Bion used to call this proto-elements as beta elements and the enabling element as the alpha element, which enables the beta elements to come together and result into a thought. And his idea was that many of the delusions of persecution, where the person feels attacked, is because the person could not find an alpha element which could enable the alpha function, and therefore of converting beta elements into a full thought, and therefore beta elements remained beta elements, which was very uncomfortable, and therefore they had to be projected out, which now appear like threatening and coming back to you. From a Kleinian point of view,
delusion, for example, delusion of persecution is still that's coming from my conditioning of cognitive background as well. um, delusion of persecution is still a format of thought only. So if there is a lack of a good container that the alpha particles which could have converted into the proper experience and perceiving in the right way, there is a wrong thought being created. But the thought has been created.
That would be explained in Bion's language in this way, that the beta elements of early childhood have remained unprocessed in some corner of the unconscious. And in other parts of the mind, the processing capacity has developed. So there is a sectoral development of the alpha function. And that sectoral development of the alpha function has not been able to integrate the beta elements which remain as they are, until the alpha function is not able to connect to those beta elements. The beta elements, because they are very uncomfortable, are projected out. Right? So we don't have a 100% beta. Hello?
Hello. So when there is this enabler alpha elements are not conducive enough to form to facilitate the beta elements, it would lead to some kind of a distorted cognitive thought. But I'm talking.
I can't hear you. Hello?
I think we're having a technical issue here. Sir, are you connected with us?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. So my question to you was that what you have been explaining in Bionian concept, that when there is a lack of enabling element called alpha elements, that can lead to non-conducive environment for the beta elements to form a proper thought. That sounds more like a cognitive distortion, or that sounds more like a psychotic person or a schizophrenic person. What about people who build negative thinking? How would Bion explain that negative thought? They say, suppose automatic, intrusive, and negative thoughts. How would he explain that?
They are much later.
Okay.
This is much more primary and fundamental than the negative thoughts, because negative thoughts are types of thoughts. They are still finished products. Negative and dysfunctional,
Exactly.
but still finished products. But we are dealing at a proto level before the thoughts can be formed, either positive or negative.
All right.
Now, this gets us into a state of what is called the nameless state. The nameless state awaiting a name. For example, let us say early childhood, a child is crying and the mother asks him, do you want milk, is it? And the child says yes, and the child is peaceful. Now what is happening is the child had a distress. It wanted to think that I want milk. All it knows is I want something, but I don't know what I want. Till the mother gives the name of the milk, and the process of distress, so to say, gets stopped. So what is happening is, in the child, there are these proto elements. Just before he can think that I want milk, before this, there are these proto elements which are sort of vibrating and creating a distress, till the mother realizes that distress by a process of projective identification, becomes a container, contains those distressing proto elements, and gives the name of milk to that want. And by knowing this name, that nameless state of distress comes to an end. It is a pre-thought state where just before a thought can form, there are these constituents of thought which are in an uneasy state of distress. And the moment somebody accepts that distress, understands it, gives back a processed form of it, the name, the nameless anxiety, the nameless irritation, the nameless dread comes to an end with the advent of a name. Because intuitively the child knows this is what it is. And it was
the interpretation from the container or the mother is
Not
very
the interpretation,
significant.
it's the naming, it's an exact naming.
Exact name.
It is as though intuitively the child knows that the perturbation, the vibration inside, that distress which leads to confusion, at times to self-doubt, at times to incapacity of concluding this distress into a name, into a complete thought. Right? That exactly is what the mother has told me. Otherwise, the child will continue to be in distress if you give the wrong name. So there is an intuitive understanding of the truth. The mind grows by that understanding, and the state of distress comes to an end by that naming. It is as though the open infinity of all that can be this thing that I am feeling, that open infinity and the fear of that open infinity was creating this distress. And the moment it is confined and made finite into a name, that open infinity converges, coalesces into a finite name, and the intuitive understanding tells me this is it, and the perturbation stops. So this is the nameless state which is put to an end by a good container. And this nameless state can be the state of confusion. It can be a state of doubt. It can be a state of irritation. And this brings us to a very important point, that irritation actually is far deeper than anger. Because at that point, you feel that irritation. Above that irritation, some people can feel deadness. Some people above that can feel boredom. But this nameless state, so to say, which are so difficult to name and articulate, these nameless states are converted and brought to an end by a good container. And Bion says that this is a very important element, that the other is necessary to help us develop the capacity for thought.
Very interesting.
And the same for feelings, that we don't know what we are feeling. And the mother tells us the baby is feeling very happy, is it? And suddenly we say, yes, this is it. And a smile comes on our face. Or the baby, you feel that that person will go away, don't like it, is it? And the baby says, yes, this is what it is. So either the nameless gets a name, or what has already got a name inside is validated from outside. It gets expressed and articulated. So Bion is focusing on the first part of the name for the nameless. And that is very important for Bion, to look at the proto-state of thought and affect, which that state is facilitated by the alpha element enabling the alpha function inside slowly. But first the alpha function is done by the container itself, and slowly the alpha function gets developed in the child. So this is something which is very important in Bion, and containing for Bion, as we discussed before, can be just a neutral containing, or a positive containing, or a negative containing. And the positive containing is very necessary for health. And as individuals at different stages of life, we all need containers, and we are looking for containers. And the therapist also is a good container. The therapy room becomes a good container. The therapy frame becomes a good container. So this is something that Bion brought in to psychoanalysis in terms of the manufacturing process of thought and feeling. Another important element that Bion brought it was the hatred towards knowledge, the envy towards knowledge, the rage towards knowledge. That apart from the containing function, very early in life, there can be a hatred towards true knowledge. There can
Of
be
the container.
No, just inside the mind of the child.
Towards container or free-flowing entity in itself?
It can be towards the container, it can be towards somebody else, it can just be too much of constitutional aggression and sadism inside the individual.
similar to Kleinian concept of rage towards
Yeah,
the
obviously,
good and the bad ending.
because Bion was a Kleinian to begin with.
Okay.
He was analyzed by Klein,
Oh.
and he was the head of the Kleinian Institute at Tavistock. So Bion started off and was Kleinian for a long time before he introduced new concepts. So in a way, he's developing the Kleinian thought, just as Klein developed the Freudian thought and took it in a radically different direction. So what Klein did to Freud, in a way, Bion continues to do to Klein. So Bion brings in these elements of envy, which breaks the linking in the thinking process. He called it attacks on linking, which leads to speech not being relevant and coherent, which leads to cognitive thought disturbance. So he brought in the elements of envy, which can break the linkage of thought. He brought in the element of hatred of true knowledge. So he called it H leading to minus K, false knowledge, the fantasy knowledge, avoiding the true knowledge, the knowledge of transformative insight. And how the thoughts are awaiting a thinker. First, the thinker is the container, and later on, it is the thinking part of us, the alpha function in us. That even as adults, we can have corners in our unconscious mind where the beta elements, which are difficult to accept and integrate, are awaiting an alpha function. So these are the elements related to the manufacturing of thought and feelings, which Kant and Bion separately elaborated, and Bion tried to bring it into psychoanalysis. He did bring it into psychoanalysis. One last point on this discussion, this question. Freud's model of a man was the model of a micro man, where all the capacities of an adult were present in the child, only at a lesser degree. But Klein refined it further and said this model is actually not correct. The child is not a micro man. So the difference is not of degree and development of intensity or depth or scope. The difference is fundamental also in terms of capacity. That we are not born with the capability to think clearly as an adult does. So there is a process of learning to think, just as there is a process of learning to walk. And just as we fumble and fall down many times before we learn to walk, we fumble and fall down many times before we think in our mind. And that fumbling and falling down is where those psychotic fantasies exist. So fantasies exist before objective rational thinking starts. And fumbling into fantasies, we slowly learn the realistic thought. And Bion goes a step further to say that any complete process of cognition or affect also is not inbuilt. Even that process of fantasy is not inbuilt. That also undergoes a developmental process, right, where the capacity slowly is developed with the help of a container. And with the development of that process, the process to think and the process to feel slowly develops as we start understanding, getting more and more names for the nameless. And slowly we enable ourselves to give names to the new nameless. So this is a very important element, that Bion brings it, Kant brings in, and they take the usual discourse of psychoanalysis 2 steps deeper, more elemental.
So what are the limits of each of them in the context of this discussion today?
There are some general limits to both of them and some limits particular to each. General limits to both of them even today are, none of them could conceptualize in terms of the simples. Simple fundamental objects as a conglomeration of which everything else could be explained. So neither Kant nor Bion could go into simple objects. What Kant went into was simple categories. So he could go to the level of simples in terms of categories, but not to the level of, like, he would say, okay, thought is impossible without involving certain categories like quality, quantity, substance, space, time. Let us say you speak a sentence. Can you speak a statement?
Me right now?
Yeah.
To elaborate the category?
Just say any statement. Let's say I put a statement. We are having a good discussion. So we is one particular form of existent. Two people are having is a specific form of an event. Good is a specific form of quality. Discussion is a specific form of event. So if you look at generically, this statement is made up of categories involving events and quality. Or X is taller than Y. X and Y are existent. Is existent and involves time, and taller is a question of quantity. So you cannot think without involving existent, space, time, quality, quantity. So these simple categories without which human thought is not possible were laid out by Immanuel Kant. See, so these are fundamental categories. So he could go to the level of simples in terms of categories, but not further. Now, beyond
limits.
Beyond, so these were Kant's limits. Kant's other limits were, Kant could never go into vicissitudes of thought. He could never go into the hold of affect on thought. He could also not go in areas like parapsychology, mysticism, spirituality. He could also not go into effect of childhood on further thought, because he was not into healing. He was primarily into epistemology. He could never go into things that Bion would go into, like hatred, attacks on linking, the ineffable. Oh, he could never go into this because these were later concepts. These concepts were not there when he was theorizing. So, and another,
they existed in the same timeline?
No, Kant is much earlier. Kant is
much earlier. Seems to be.
One of the difficulties of Kant also is Kant brings into picture a subject-object dichotomy, and this brings in alienation, purposelessness. Ethics and mysticism become without any foundation in one sense. Spirituality remains open but uncertain. So, in a way, these are the limitations of Immanuel Kant. And with regard to Bion, Bion was trying it out for the first time. So it's a trial and error of bringing in epistemology. Second, he is developing epistemology within the context of psychoanalysis from wherever he could. And he was not trained in epistemology. And he was not how should I put it? He was not very interested also and capable also of developing a model of the mind.
Sir, we lost your connection in between. He was not.
He was also not well trained in model of the in epistemology, and not very interested and partly capable also of generating
Trying to
model of
find.
the mind. So these were his
Mm.
limitations. And when he came to the ineffable O, again the limitations came up because he was not trained in spirituality. So his Bion's training created a very big limitation for what he was trying to do. But what he did
Mm.
was radically brilliant, very original, and very courageous. So these were some of the specific limitations of Bion and Kant, and some were generic limitations as we enlisted them out. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Can you say it again?
Having said the limitations, I also see the applications. Bionian's concept can be applied on a very difficult patients which tend to fall out of the therapy space because of their running episodes of schizophrenia, mania, or negative schizophrenia, or where the effect is more in form of somatization, जैसा लगता है, but it is not somatic, it is more of sensations.
Bion
So
also
even
did
to
lot
do with
of
mental retardation
yeah.
and developmental disorders also.
Bion also laid a very important emphasis we forgot to mention on frustration.
Oh,
So for him, frustration and infinity were very important. Frustration because this precedes, so to say, creation of further effects like sadness or anger. Like a desire is frustrated, and then we get into sadness and anger. So this is like a pre-stage of sadness and anger development. And that is a very important stage to be, because this almost gets near to that disintegrated state of that nameless distress. And second is infinity, because we will take up a few moments later, but just to mention it, this is at the heart of catastrophic thinking and in the heart of disproportionate generation of affect, the infinity.
oh.
So frustration and infinity were very important concepts for Bion.
Is this infinity Bionian's infinity?
It's a specific kind of understanding of the concept. I'll come to it in a moment. We have only 1 minute to go. In the second part, I'll start off with this.
Right, sir. See you all in the part 2 in continuation.